weren't even watching. I've just loaded that film. This is a different film. Wound on perfectly normally. When I had the number 1 in the window at the back here, flipped that back down, flipped the lever back over here. Number 1 frame counter comes up here. Let's see what happens. Shutter's cocked, fires. Wind on. Number 2 comes up, wind till it stops, cock the shutter, fire. Wind on. Number 3 comes up, wind on till it stops, cock the shutter, fire. Same for number 4. Same for number 5. Same for number 6. Same for number 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 12. That should be our 12th exposure. That should be it. What happens if we keep winding on? The red sign is on here telling us we've reached the end of the film. At this stage we can keep winding and firing until it's all wound onto the take-up spool. I don't know whether we can flip the lever over. I'll have to consult the man. If we flip the lever over, can we wind right through? We can. That allows you to wind the film all the way through the camera to the end, until it's all on the take-up spool. If we flip up our little window here, we should be able to see that there's no more film going across. We've succeeded. It's all on the exposed reel. Okay, so that wound film exactly as it should do. The frame counter worked exactly as it should do. If I take that out, take out my supply spool and wind my film back onto it. I can do this again. Difficult getting this centered up so that it spools correctly. You can see it's pushed off to one end. That's better. Of course, lucky this is only a test film because it's going to be somewhat exposed to the light. But all I'm doing here is rolling my film back onto the supply spool, and here's the film. And this was a Vari-Color 2S film, and I don't know when Kodak last made Vari-Color 2S professional film, so it's been sitting around here in the cabinet for a long time, I would say. I haven't done quite a perfect job here because I can see there's a bit of a hump in the film between the two spools, but it'll probably suffice. I want to run it through the camera once more, make sure there are no hiccups with the film advance. it looks good to me. But things have looked good to me before. These backing papers aren't meant to be used multiple times. Alright, let's try again. We've got our camera. Supply spool there. Take up spool here. That's all clicked into place. Take our film leader, tuck it in the slot, make sure this is all centred up and lying nicely. Wind that on. That's all wound on correctly. Close the back door. You can see through the window here because we've got the flap open. If the flap was closed, you just see an X. Tells you it's blanked off. So the flap's open. Lever's over here at the right hand end of the camera. Just wind on until we reach number 1. There's the arrows showing us the film starting up. There's number 1. We can close this little blind off. Flip the lever here back over towards the centre of the camera. Cock the shutter. We're ready to expose frame number 1. Wind on until the film advance stops, cock the shutter, frame number 2. Wind on till the film advance stops, cock the shutter, frame number 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8, 9, 10, 11. Here's 12. This is the last exposure. Wind on. The red dot comes up. A solid red dot visible in the window there. End of film. Flip this lever over to the right and we can continue winding the film right through until it's all on the take-up spool. That was it there. If we flip that window up, we'll see that there's no more film. And there it is on the take-up spool. So the film advance is working correctly now. What other things have I got to do to this camera before I let it go? Well, I want to service the shutter. The shutter appears to work. I haven't tested it at all, but that'll be the next thing to do. Let's have a quick check now while the going's good. Set that to 1/10 of a second. It's a Synchro-Compur shutter. Let's see how it behaves. That wasn't bad. Possibly a little bit slow. What's it like on the slower speeds? We'll try it on a second. And I'm releasing it right here at the front. I'm just leaning in with my fingernail and hitting the release. That runs down. Alright, that should be a fairly simple service job. At least the shutter works. That doesn't show any obvious faults. What about the highest speed? What if we set this to a 500th? Now this Synchro-Compur shutter, that's like the Synchro-Compur shutter on a Retina 2A camera. Basically it's a Compur rapid shutter with the extra flash sync mechanism. Like the Compur rapid shutters, it has an extra spring to give you your highest shutter speed. In this case a 500th of a second. To use the 500th of a second speed in a shutter like this, you have to set the speed first before you cock the shutter. Not afterwards, it won't like it. That works fine. So basically it's a working shutter. Just needs to be taken out, cleaned, serviced and put back in. That should be an easy one. But then I've said that before. Well, I think I have the answer as to why this thing is reluctant to open and close sometimes. There's a little foot here on the door which folds out. And that's job is to hold the camera square on the table, nice and level. Table tripod if you like. It's loose. Because it's loose, it swings round and catches inside the inside edge of the body here, stopping the front door from opening correctly. Really, that rivet needs to be thumped. That's quite loose. How would it get like that? That's very hard to say. It may have been thumped, it may have been standing out on in the set position. Let's have a look at the marks on it. And it's taken a thump. It's certainly pushed inwards rather than outwards. Well, that's interesting. I hadn't spotted that. I just noticed it when I went to fold up the camera and it didn't want to fold. I couldn't understand why it didn't want to fold up. Never mind. So, what have we got here? Well, here's our retainer ring. And I was having a quick look around. I can't find my my lens spanner at the moment, so I'll try using this pair of pliers that I've modified previously and see if this will do it for me. That'll do it. That's got that loose, so I can probably get that the rest of the way with a pair of stiff tweezers. That's it's always the first bit that's hardest to get. Once it's broken free, you're away laughing typically. Anytime you're working near the bellows, you have to be extremely careful with tools because you do not want to slip and scratch the glass lens, of course, but just as important, you don't want to slip and damage the bellows. So be very cautious about what sort of tools you do this with. Here I'm just using a stiff pair of tweezers because once I'd got that ring loose with those pliers have modified tips. The tips are very narrow. They're just made for getting into rings like this. That is pretty much off now. I'll just run that the rest of the way around with a toothpick. Toothpick's even better than tweezers because it's even less likely to scratch anything. That's it. That's come loose. So now another shutter's loose. Open the front of the camera and I can lift the shutter out entirely. Now there's a shim ring at the back here. I've got to be careful that that goes back in place. The retaining ring, of course, is still sitting here in the mount. But here's the shutter. The focus mount is held to the front group with 3 small screws from the outside. Be careful backing these screws out. Just sort of do them half a turn at a time until you can get them free. They're very small, they're not particularly long, and easily lost. So here's the name ring. That's just loose. I'm just looking to see if it was ever there, stuck there. Sometimes name rings are stuck in with a little drop of glue or lacquer. That one wasn't. Here's our front group, or our front element rather. This has to come out of the shutter, and so does the rear group. Now the rear group will probably come out with a friction tool. I'm less enthusiastic that a friction tool will help with this one. Let's try a friction tool on the front. Well, this is really the middle group really. Yeah, it did come loose. I'm pleasantly surprised. You have almost no surface area there to engage a friction tool, so often they're very, very difficult to get loose. Sometimes you have to drill holes into the mount or cut notches in it in order to engage a tool, or in a case like that, if it sticks out proud of the front of the mount and you can get a spanner on it, you could make a spanner to grip the outside diameter. The rear element here came out with a friction tool as expected. It came out quite easily. And the glass looks good. So the shutter itself, just looking at the state of this, it's a bit grimy looking, probably not going to cause me any problems. So this locking screw here, or it's a rivet actually, just rotate that, that'll rotate, we can rotate that round. That's just bayoneted on, and we're into the shutter. Here's the shutter speed setting cameraing. I have that off. Where are we in the camera? I should be here. Okay. Unhook this spring, that spring. This is the called the main lever. The shutter release lever, will that lift out for us? Yes, it will. Unhook that spring. That's the B lever. Let's get that off. That's the B lever spring and the retaining screw. The B lever, which looks intact. Occasionally you'll find them broken. I don't think, not so much on cameras like this, but oh yeah, one's just like this actually. Anything that you could manually cock, somebody has will enthusiastically, the shutter jams, and they may enthusiastically help it by pushing the setting lever back the other way. What's that? Little thread of metal there. I don't know where that sprung from. It's very fragile. It's a bit of aluminium, I would think. That out, unhook that spring, and of course it tried to get away, but it didn't succeed. Off with that lever. Off with the pallets. 2 standoffs. They can come out. A single screw here holds in the flash contact. This is the moving contact I'm talking about. Let's get that screw out. Up with that becomes its operating lever and the high speed spring, the 500th of a second spring. This wheel comes out. That's part of the flash sync mechanism, and that drives the pallet wheel. The pallet wheel stays on the mechanism plate. The fixed flash contact can come out of the shutter. That's fixed to the mechanism plate, single screw. That's wedged down into the case. Sometimes it's easier to get out, other times it's not. That one was an easy one. That's all that needs to come off the mechanism plate. We'll turn our attention to the back of the shutter. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate into the shutter case. We can split the shutter. Here's our mechanism plate, 5 shutter blades. It all looks quite clean. The diaphragm, I'm checking that now. The setting's quite stiff. It feels quite stiff to move, but I'm not seeing any problem with the blades themselves. So it probably means that the stiffness is probably dried out grease between the setting ring here at the back and the shutter case. Can we get this off first? Yes, we can. 2 screws visible that hold the lever here to the internal setting ring. Let's just get those out. Supporting that from behind with my finger. And the same on the other side. That screw wasn't particularly tight. It was a bit suspicious. Let's recover those 2 screws. And with the setting lever. Now the setting lever is not dead flat. I can see that. If you look at the reflections off that, you'll see that it's not dead flat. There's a certain amount of distortion to this. Some of that's intentional, probably the most of it. So it provides some controlled friction between this setting plate and the back of the case. And if you didn't have some controlled friction there, because there's no click stops, you'd knock the setting of the aperture very, very easily, and you'd end up with an awful lot of bad exposures as a result. So a bit of slight distortion to this ring, that's quite normal, and it's beneficial, or can be. This one looks a bit exaggerated to me, which may be why it was a little bit stiff. So 3 screws here hold the plate in here, the retaining plate. The retaining plate retains all of the diaphragm blades, and we have, and what have we got here? 10, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 blades. There we go, and took that lot out. So this is a clean example. As I said, this is quite good. Tasks typically required here are to make sure that the case is very clean, remove any traces of oil and grease, front and back. This is the moving setting ring. That's the one coupled to the setting lever on the back of the shutter, and as the setting lever turns, this is turned. As it's turned, it swings these blades in on their pivots. There's a pivot point on each end of the blade. One set of pivots runs in here, and the other set of pivots runs in here. The blades normally come out as a nice neat rosette like that because they're interleaved, but we need that apart to clean them, so that's them in a heap. So these parts I've got to clean now with naphtha, and I usually start in the same place every time. I start with the case, I start with the 2 plates, I do my blades, and I reassemble all of that shutter case so that the diaphragm is in there, and when I'm happy it's working smooth, that's fine. Then I turn my attention to the mechanism plate and shutter blades, and then after that it's a case of cleaning and putting back the control gear from the top of the mechanism plate, closing the shutter up, and cleaning and putting the lenses back. But first, cleaning this lot up with a bit of naphtha. The first thing that catches my attention is the state of this aperture settings ring and shutter speed settings ring. That's a bit distorted. I'm just going to see if I can press that back down a bit flat to the case. That hole will be, yeah, it's quite thick aluminium there, but because of the cutout in it, as it's been bent on there, it's taken a sharp bend. It hasn't followed the curve evenly. So I've loosened the screw off, and I'm pushing it down and tightening the screw up, see if it's taken it out. Yeah, it has. It's nice neat curve there now, instead of that bump that it had right there at between F11 and F16. Okay, cleaning time.